Welcome back. If you're new here, this channel is dedicated to real stories sent in by our subscribers. Camping trips, remote trails, deep forests, and the things people encounter out there when they're far from help and far from anyone who would hear them scream. These are submitted by our subscribers. We don't sensationalize. We don't editorialize. We just read what they sent us. So if you're comfortable, settle in. This one's going to be a long night. Story 1. I want to start by saying I am not someone who scares easily. I've been hiking and backpacking since I was a teenager, and I've done trails across Virginia, North Carolina, and Tennessee. I've slept alone on ridgelines in the middle of thunderstorms. I've had bears walk through my campsite at 2 in the morning and just calmly went back to sleep after they left. So when I tell you that what happened to me on a trail off Skyline Drive 3 years ago genuinely changed the way I approach being alone in the backcountry, I need you to understand that it is coming from someone who considered himself about as unshakable as you get. It was mid-October, peak foliage season in the Shenandoah. I'd taken a long weekend, Thursday through Sunday, to do a solo loop I'd been planning since the spring. The loop wasn't particularly technical, maybe 30 miles total, with campsites at decent intervals. I'd done similar mileage before and wasn't expecting any trouble. I parked at the trailhead early Thursday morning while it was still dark, strapped on my headlamp, and started walking. The first day was perfect. Cool air, leaves coming down in sheets of orange and red, barely anyone on the trail. I passed a couple of day hikers heading back toward the road around midday, exchanged a few words, and then didn't see another soul. By 4 in the afternoon, I'd covered about 11 miles and set up my tent at a designated backcountry site. I cooked, sat by a small fire, and was asleep by 8. Everything was exactly what I'd hoped for. Day 2 is where things started going sideways, though it took me a while to realize it. I left camp early, around 6, before the sun had fully come up. About 2 hours in, I came to a junction that I didn't remember from my research. There was a blaze on a tree going left and another going straight. And according to my map, I should have been continuing straight, but something about the terrain felt off. The ridge I was supposed to be following seemed to be on my left, not in front of me. I stood at that junction for probably 10 minutes, going back and forth on it, before deciding to trust the map and continue straight. That was the wrong call. About 45 minutes later, the trail started narrowing in a way that didn't match any of the notes I'd made when I planned the route. The ground cover was thicker, and the blazes on the trees were older and faded, not the fresh, bright orange paint you'd expect on a maintained trail. I stopped and checked my compass. I was heading northeast when I should have been heading east-southeast. Somewhere I'd gotten turned around. I backtracked to the junction and this time took the left fork. By the time I got myself sorted out and on the right path, it was past noon and I'd lost almost 3 hours. I was annoyed but not panicked. I adjusted my plan, cut out a side trail I'd intended to take, and pushed to make up some time. The goal was to reach the next designated campsite before dark, which was now going to be tight. I was moving fast and not paying as much attention to my surroundings as I normally would. I was focused on making miles, and that's probably why I didn't notice the man until he was less than 50 feet behind me. I only caught him because I stopped to take a drink of water and happened to glance back down the trail. He was there just walking. Hiking clothes, pack on his back, nothing immediately alarming about any of it. I waited for him to catch up because the polite thing to do on trail when someone's clearly moving faster is to let them pass. But as I waited, I noticed that he wasn't actually moving faster. His pace was the same as mine had been. He wasn't trying to close the distance. He was maintaining it. I started walking again. About 10 minutes later, I stopped again and looked back. He was still there. Same distance, 50 feet. I told myself it was a coincidence. 2 people hiking at the same pace on the same trail isn't suspicious. It happens. I kept moving. The next time I stopped to check my map, he was still there. Same distance, 50 feet. Now I'm starting to do the math in my head. This man has been behind me for at least half an hour. Every time I stop, he stops. Every time I move, he moves. There are no other junctions on this section of trail for another 4 miles. So it's not like I could verify he was going somewhere different. He was just there, right behind me, constant. I picked up my pace deliberately to see what happened. I moved into a near jog for about 5 minutes. When I slowed and looked back, he was still 50 feet behind me. He had matched my pace exactly without closing the gap at all. At this point, my stomach dropped. Whatever this was, it was not a coincidence. I started running through options. I could confront him, just stop and let him catch up and ask him straight out what he was doing. I could get off trail and let him pass and see if he kept going or stopped. I could push hard and try to get to the campsite before dark where there might be other people. None of these felt particularly good. I chose to get off trail. There was a dense stand of rhododendron to my right, and I pushed into it, crouching down behind the thicket, where I could see the trail but wouldn't be easily visible from it. I waited. 3 minutes passed. 5 minutes. I kept my eyes on the section of trail where he should have appeared by now. Nothing. 7 minutes in, I heard footsteps coming slowly up the trail. Not the pace of someone hiking, more like someone walking carefully, deliberately. The footsteps stopped right where I'd left the trail. I held my breath. There was silence for probably 30 seconds, which felt like 30 minutes. Then the footsteps started again, but instead of continuing up the trail, they were coming off the trail, coming into the rhododendron, not toward me directly, but into the thicket to my left, searching. The way you'd move if you were looking for something that had just gone into the brush. I didn't make a decision so much as my body made it for me. I pushed out of the rhododendron on the far side and ran. I ran harder than I think I've ever run with a full pack on. I didn't look back for probably a quarter mile. When I finally did, there was nothing behind me on the trail. I made it to the campsite in record time. There was one other tent already set up, and I have never been so relieved to see a stranger's tent in my life. I set up as close to them as reasonably possible without being weird about it. Said hello to the couple inside when they came out to cook dinner, and stayed by their fire until well past dark. I didn't see the man again for the rest of the trip. I finished the loop and got back to my car without incident. But I never once stopped looking back over my shoulder the whole way out. I've thought about it a lot since then. The thing that stays with me isn't the fear of what might have happened. It's the precision of it. 50 feet, exactly, every single time I checked. The matching of the pace with no attempt to close the gap. The deliberate entry into the thicket when I left the trail. Whatever that man was doing, he was practiced at it. He had done it before. I still hike the Appalachian region. I'm not going to stop. But I now carry more than just bear spray. I never go without telling at least 2 people my exact route and check-in schedule. And I never once let someone walk behind me on a trail without knowing exactly who they are and where they're headed. Story 2. 4 days on the Nolichuck. This was about 5 years ago when I was living in eastern Tennessee, not far from the Nolichucky River Gorge. It's a beautiful stretch of the Appalachians out there, and I'd done day hikes in the area plenty of times but had never committed to a multi-day trip. I'd just turned 30 and told myself I was going to do a solo 4-day backpacking trip as a kind of reset. Work had been rough, my personal life was a mess, and I needed to be somewhere with no phone signal and no people. I got the no phone signal part. The no people part did not work out. I'll skip over the first day and a half because nothing happened, and it was everything I'd hoped for. Quiet, hard work, good miles. I set up my second camp on a narrow flat section above the river, maybe 20 feet from the water's edge. Beautiful spot. I got a fire going, ate, and was sitting there just watching the river, and in the dark, when I heard something move on the opposite bank, Now, the Nolichucky isn't wide at most points in the gorge. Across from where I was sitting, it was maybe 60 feet of fast water, close enough to hear someone moving through brush on the other side. I looked over and saw a shape crouched down at the water's edge across the river. My first thought was an animal coming down to drink, but the shape was wrong. Too tall when it stood up, too deliberate in how it moved. It was a person. They stood there for a while on the far bank, not doing anything, just standing. I couldn't make out any features. It was dark and they were a shadow, but the posture was unmistakably human. I waved, no response. I called out a hello, no response. After a couple of minutes, the shape moved back from the bank and disappeared into the trees on the far side. I told myself it was probably just another hiker who'd made camp on the other side of the river and come down for water. Completely reasonable explanation. I tried to believe it. I went to bed and slept reasonably well. Woke up just before dawn to get an early start. I was packing up my tent in the gray morning light when I noticed something at the edge of camp that hadn't been there the night before. A small pile of stones, maybe 10 or 12 of them, stacked carefully just at the tree line behind where my tent had been. A deliberate arrangement, not something that happens by accident. Someone had been in my camp while I slept. I packed up fast and moved. I pushed hard the whole third day, covering more miles than I'd planned and keeping my head up constantly. Checking the river crossings, checking the tree lines. I didn't see anyone. By mid-afternoon, I was at the spot I'd intended for my third camp, and I almost kept going, but my legs were done. I set up, made a cold dinner because I didn't want to build a fire, and got in my tent early. Sometime in the night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the gravel along the river. Not animal footsteps, deliberate, evenly spaced human footsteps. They came from upstream, moved slowly past my camp, and continued downstream. I lay completely still listening until they faded out. In the morning, I found prints in the soft mud at the water's edge. Boot prints, large, wide, deep tread. Whoever it was had walked right past my tent in the middle of the night, and I'd had no idea until I heard them. I cut the trip short, 3 days instead of 4. I hiked out that morning and didn't stop for anything. I made it back to my car before noon, drove straight home, and didn't touch my gear for 2 weeks. The thing with the stones has never left me. To stack those stones like that, carefully, intentionally, right behind where someone is sleeping, takes time and quiet. It's not something you do accidentally, it was a message. I've gone back and forth for 5 years on what it was supposed to mean, and I still don't have an answer that doesn't scare me. Story 3. The Cabin on the Ridge. I grew up in western North Carolina and have been hiking in the mountains there my whole life. When I was 24, I decided to do a solo overnight trip on a trail I hadn't been on before. A less traveled path that climbed up toward a ridge about 7 or 8 miles from the trailhead. A friend had mentioned it offhandedly and I looked it up. Found minimal information about it, which honestly made me more interested. I like trails that aren't crowded. The hike up was good. Hard climb, decent views through the trees, no other hikers. I made it to the ridge by early afternoon and found a flat section that looked perfect for a campsite. Set up my tent, collected wood, got a small fire going. By the time it was dark, I was comfortable, warm, and relaxed. I sat up reading until maybe 10 o'clock and then turned in. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but it was deep in the night. No particular sound had woken me. I just came awake the way you sometimes do. I lay there in the dark, and then I became aware of a smell. Wood smoke. Not from my own fire, which I'd put out before bed. This was fresh smoke coming from somewhere nearby. I unzipped my tent and stepped out. The sky was clear, and the stars were bright enough to see by once my eyes adjusted. I turned in the direction the smell was coming from, and maybe 150 yards away, just barely visible through the trees, there was a light, orange and flickering. A fire. I stood and watched it for a while. It didn't move. Whoever had built it was just sitting on the other side of the ridge. and they had to have gotten there after I'd gone to sleep, because when I'd scanned the area before turning in, there had been nothing. I went back into my tent, but I didn't sleep. I lay awake listening. Around what I estimated was 3 in the morning, I heard footsteps. They were moving along the ridge in the direction of my tent, unhurried. I reached for the knife I keep in my pack and held it and waited. The footsteps slowed as they got close to my tent, stopped maybe 20 feet away. Then there was nothing. Just silence. I couldn't even hear breathing. Whoever it was just stood there in the dark outside my tent for what felt like a very long time. Maybe 2 minutes, maybe 5. I genuinely couldn't tell. Then the footsteps started again, moving away back in the direction of the fire. I stayed awake until morning. As soon as there was enough light to move safely, I packed up everything and started down the trail. But before I left, I made myself walk toward where I'd seen the fire because I wanted to know. There was a structure there. I almost want to call it a cabin, but it was more like a rough shelter built from cut logs, partially roofed, with a fire pit out front that was still smoldering. There were things inside. A sleeping area with what looked like animal skins laid out, cans of food on a rough wooden shelf, tools hanging from the walls, hatchets, knives, things I didn't examine closely. Whoever lived there had been doing so for a long time. There was no one home. I left quickly and didn't stop moving until I was at the trailhead. I told myself the person who lived there was probably just a hermit, someone who'd gone off grid, and that the late night walk past my tent was just curiosity. I've been telling myself that for years. Some days I believe it, and some days I don't. If you've made it this far and you're enjoying these stories, now is a great time to hit that subscribe button. New submissions coming every week, and we go through them all. You won't want to miss what's coming. Story 4. What happened to Marcus? I'm going to tell this story because I think it deserves to be told, even though my friend Marcus has never talked about it publicly and probably never will. I've changed his name, and I'm leaving out enough details that he won't be identifiable. I was there for part of it, and what I know of the rest he told me in pieces over the 2 years after it happened. Marcus and I had been going on camping trips together since we were in our early 20s. He grew up in Southwest Virginia, right at the edge of the Appalachians, and knew those mountains better than anyone I've ever met. I'm not exaggerating when I say the man had a compass in his head. He never got turned around, never misjudged weather, never made rookie mistakes. He was the most capable person in the outdoors I have ever spent time with, which is why what happened to him made no sense to me for a long time. We had planned a 5-day trip in early September on a trail in the Unaka Mountain area of Tennessee. Long, remote, serious terrain. The kind of trip Marcus loved. The kind of trip I was mostly along for because being around him made me confident enough to attempt things I wouldn't have tried on my own. The first 2 days were uneventful. We covered good ground, camped in nice spots, cooked decent food, and talked the way you do when you're deep enough in the woods that there's nothing else to think about except the conversation in front of you. On the third morning, Marcus said he wanted to take a detour to check out an area off trail that he'd found on an old survey map. He described it as a high meadow that most people didn't know about. A few hours round trip, I chose not to go. My knees were bothering me, and an unplanned off-trail detour didn't appeal. We agreed to meet back at camp by mid-afternoon at the latest. Marcus was not back by mid-afternoon. He was not back by sunset. By the time it was fully dark, I was seriously alarmed because Marcus did not miss time checks. It wasn't in his character. I had a satellite communicator, and I used it to send a message to his wife, giving her our general location and telling her I was concerned. I also started a very large fire. He came back around 10 o'clock at night. I heard him before I saw him because his footsteps were wrong. Too quick and uneven, not his usual pace. He walked into the firelight, and I knew immediately that something had happened. His jacket was torn. His face was cut above one eyebrow. a clean-looking cut that had dried blood tracking down the side of his face. He sat down by the fire without speaking. I asked him what happened. He said he'd gotten disoriented off trail. I told him that was impossible and he knew it. He didn't respond to that. I asked about the cut on his face and he said he fell. I let it go for the night because he clearly wasn't going to talk. I cleaned up the cut, made him eat something, and we both turned in. He slept for 14 hours straight. When he woke up the next morning, he was more himself, but still quiet. We broke camp and hiked out without him saying anything about what had happened. On the drive home, he stared out the window the entire time. Over the following months, I got pieces of it out of him, never all at once, never willingly. What I understand happened is this. He found the meadow on the map and it was real, exactly where the survey said it would be. While he was up there exploring, he encountered a man, not a hiker. The man had a structure up there, not a tent, something more permanent, and he was not welcoming. Marcus is not someone who is easily frightened, and the fact that this man frightened him tells you something. Marcus tried to leave and the man followed him back into the tree line. There was a confrontation of some kind, physical, which is where the cut came from. Marcus got away. That's all I know for certain. Every time I've tried to get more, he changes the subject or gives me one-word answers. He still goes camping. We've been out together since. But he won't go back to that area. Won't look at maps of it. Won't discuss it. The Marcus who came back from that meadow on day 3 is not exactly the same person who walked away from camp that morning. And I don't think he ever fully came back from whatever he encountered up there. Story 5. 3 weeks alone in Southwest Virginia. In the summer after I finished graduate school, I gave myself a trip as a graduation present. 3 weeks solo, moving through the George Washington and Jefferson National Forests in Southwest Virginia, roughly following the Virginia Highlands Horse Trail, before cutting south toward Mount Rogers and the Grayson Highlands. I'd been planning it for 2 years. I had good gear, solid backcountry experience, and a very detailed route worked out. The first week was the best week of camping I've ever had in my life. No exaggeration. The scenery is stunning, the trail was quiet. I had the campsites almost entirely to myself. I got into a good rhythm of miles and felt strong every day. By the end of week 1, I was ahead of schedule and in better shape than I'd started. Week 2 was different. It started on the 9th day. I was moving through a heavily forested section, long miles with no views, just canopy and trail. Late in the afternoon, I came around a bend and found something sitting in the middle of the trail. It took me a second to process what I was looking at. It was a doll. A child's doll, the plastic kind, seated upright in the center of the trail with its back to me, so I was looking at the back of its head. Old and weathered, the plastic yellowed, some of the hair missing. I don't know why, but I didn't touch it. I stepped around it and kept moving. But I thought about it for the rest of the afternoon. The next morning, I found one of my food bag's hang cords on the ground. I hang my food every night using a bare hang, and the cord I use goes up over a branch and back down where I tie it off. The bag itself was still in the tree, perfectly intact, all the food still there. But the cord had been untied from where I'd secured it at the bottom and laid on the ground in a careful coil. Someone had found my camp in the night, located my food hang, untied the cord, and then done nothing with it. Just left the cord on the ground. I broke camp fast and put in long miles that day. On the 11th night, I was camped near a spring when I woke up to the sound of someone talking. Not near me, maybe 100 yards off through the trees. Not loud, more like someone having a conversation at normal volume. I couldn't make out words. After a few minutes, it stopped. I want to be careful here, because I know how this sounds and I want to be accurate. The talking didn't sound threatening on its own. People camp in these forests, people talk. But it was nearly 2 a.m, and as I lay there listening, I realized that I was only hearing one voice. Not a conversation between 2 people, one person talking, steadily without pause for several minutes. It stopped and I didn't hear it again. I lay awake for a long time. On the 12th day, I came across a campsite that appeared recently used. Ashes in the fire ring that were still slightly warm when I held my hand over them. A tin cup next to the ring, boot prints all around. Whoever had been there had left within the last few hours. What stopped me was what was arranged in the ashes, bones. I am not a hunter and I'm not trained in any relevant way, but they looked like they were from a small animal, probably a rabbit or something similar, and they were laid out in a deliberate pattern in the center of the fire ring. Not just dumped, arranged. I didn't camp that night. I kept walking until I ran out of light, and then set up my tent with no fire, ate cold food, and lay awake listening to the forest. Day 13, I saw someone. They were maybe 200 yards ahead of me on the trail, moving in the same direction. I only had them in view for a few seconds before they turned off the trail to the right and disappeared. They were wearing dark clothing and moving at a good pace. No pack that I could see. I slowed down. I waited at the point where they'd left the trail for a full 5 minutes, watching the tree line before moving past. I didn't see them again that day or the next. I completed the trip, all 3 weeks. But I want to be honest and say that the last 9 days were not the experience I had planned. I was vigilant in a way that was exhausting. I barely slept. I didn't make fires for the last 5 nights. I moved faster than I'd intended and cut out some of the side trails I'd wanted to take. When I got back to my car and drove out of the mountains, I sat in a gas station parking lot for 20 minutes just breathing. I've never been so relieved to be somewhere with streetlights. Story 6. The sound outside the tent in Pisgah. Me and 2 friends, I'll call them Derek and Sadie, went camping in the Pisgah National Forest in North Carolina about 3 years ago. We were all in our late 20s, all had camping experience, and had done a few trips together before. This was a long weekend, Friday night through Sunday morning, on a trail we'd done once before and liked. Nothing ambitious, just a comfortable trip into familiar territory. We got to the trailhead early Friday evening, hiked in a couple of miles to a campsite we'd used the previous year, and got set up while there was still enough light to see what we were doing. 3 tents, a group fire, a relaxed night of cooking and talking. Nothing unusual. We turned in around midnight. I'm a light sleeper and I woke up sometime in the very early hours of Saturday morning. I'm not sure of the exact time. I lay there in my tent for a minute trying to figure out what had woken me. The forest was doing its normal nighttime thing. Wind moving through the trees and occasional sounds. And then I heard it. Breathing. Not from inside the tent. From directly outside. Close, maybe 2 or 3 feet from the tent wall. Slow and steady and very clearly human. I reached for my headlamp without turning it on and just lay there listening. The breathing continued for what felt like several minutes, but was probably only 30 seconds or a minute. Then it stopped. Then I heard movement, weight shifting, the soft compression of leaves under feet. The footsteps moved away from my tent, and I heard them moving toward where Derek's tent was set up, about 15 feet away. I got out of my sleeping bag and unzipped the tent as quietly as I could and stepped out. Derek's tent was dark and still. I stood in the clearing and looked around the campsite. The fire had burned down to coals and was giving off almost no light. I turned on my headlamp. Nothing in the clearing with me. I walked the perimeter of the campsite, shining the light into the tree line in every direction. Nothing. I woke Derek and Sadie, and we sat up together until it got light. Neither of them had heard anything. Both had slept through it. In the morning, we looked at the area around the tents and found the leaves disturbed in a way that was consistent with someone having stood right where I'd heard the breathing. No clear boot prints. The ground was too dry and leaf-covered, but the disturbance was there. We packed up and moved to a different campsite Saturday night, a couple miles further down the trail, more exposed, near a stream crossing where we figured sound would carry and we'd hear anyone approaching. Saturday night was quiet and nothing happened. But here's the part I haven't been able to stop thinking about. When we got back to the trailhead Sunday morning, there were 2 vehicles parked there, one of which was ours. The other was a truck, an older model, dark colored. It had been there when we arrived Friday evening, and we'd assumed it belonged to someone day hiking. But it was still there Sunday morning. Whoever owned it had not returned to the trailhead in 2 full days. I don't know if that truck had anything to do with what I heard outside my tent Friday night, but I've never been able to stop connecting them. If these stories have you second-guessing your next camping trip, drop a comment below telling us where you camp and what trail you've had your most uncomfortable experience on. We read every single comment, and some of the best ones find their way into future videos. Story 7. He was in the water. I need to get this out, and I've been sitting on it for about 2 years, so bear with me because it's still hard to talk about even in writing. I do a lot of solo kayak camping. For people who don't know, that's exactly what it sounds like. You paddle in with all your gear loaded in the kayak and camp on riverbanks or sandbars or lake shores. I've been doing it for 6 or 7 years in various river systems throughout the Appalachian region. The New River, the Gauley, the Greenbrier, smaller creeks throughout West Virginia and Virginia. It's a specific type of backcountry camping, and the advantage is that you can access spots that trail hikers can never get to, and you can move fast if you need to. The disadvantage, which I didn't fully appreciate until this trip, is that you're working on a river corridor. You can't just cut cross-country if something goes wrong. You're moving in one direction with the water. This was a 4-day trip on the Greenbrier River in West Virginia in late September. A section of it that I'd done once before, calm water, beautiful valley, very isolated. I had put in at a small access point and had roughly 40 miles of river ahead of me. The plan was to paddle 10 to 12 miles a day and camp each night on the bank. First day and night were fine. Good water, found a nice sandbar to camp on, slept well. Second day, I started noticing something following the river, on the bank. It would have been easy to miss if you weren't paying attention, but I was out there alone, and I had nothing else to focus on. So I was watching everything. There were sections of bank where the vegetation had been pushed through recently, broken branches, bent grass, in a way that was consistent with something large moving parallel to the river. Too sustained and directional for deer, moving at roughly my pace. I paddled faster. Whatever it was matched the pace. I want to be very clear that I told myself this was an animal. Black bear or possibly deer, even though the pattern seemed wrong. I wanted it to be an animal. I pushed my daily mileage and made camp on the second night well after dark, setting up my headlamp on a high bank above the river. I was tired enough to sleep despite being uneasy. Around 3 a.m, I woke up to a sound from the river below me. A quiet, methodical sound that I couldn't immediately place. I lay in my tent trying to figure out what I was hearing. It was rhythmic, evenly spaced. After a minute, I realized it was the sound of someone walking in the shallows. The quiet splash of each step and a few inches of moving water. The steps came up the river from downstream. They slowed as they got below my campsite. Stopped. I was 12 feet above the water line on the bank. From where I was lying in my tent, I couldn't see the river. I could only hear it. The footsteps in the water didn't move for a long time. Maybe 10 minutes. I lay absolutely still, not even wanting to shift my weight in the sleeping bag. Then they started again, this time going upstream, past my position, and fading out. I did not go back to sleep. At first light, I looked over the bank at the river below. There were impressions in the sandy mud at the water's edge directly below my campsite. Shoe prints. Someone had been standing in the river below me for an extended period of time in the middle of the night. I was on the water by 6 a.m, and I pushed hard. I paddled until my arms gave out, took short breaks, and paddled again. I covered 16 miles that day and took out at the first road access point I could reach, which was not the planned takeout point. It took me a week to stop jumping every time I heard an unexpected sound. I've thought about it so many times. The thing about the river corridor that gets me now is the thing that should have scared me going in. You are visible on the water. Anyone on either bank can see you at all times. A person could follow a kayaker down a river for days, and the kayaker would never know, because you're looking forward, not at the banks. I don't know how long someone had been tracking me on that trip. It might have started that first day. It might have been longer than that. I don't know. Story 8. What we found at mile marker 23. My hiking partner Sarah and I have been doing a section-by-section completion of a long trail in the southern Appalachians for the past 4 years. We work it in chunks whenever we can, both get time away, usually long weekends and the occasional full week. We've covered maybe 2/3 of it at this point. Most of it has been beautiful and uneventful in the best way. One section about 2 years ago was not. We were doing a 4-day stretch that crossed some of the more remote parts of the trail, away from the popular sections that see heavy thru-hiker traffic. We weren't expecting much company, and we got very little. Saw 3 other hikers the entire first day, and nobody after that. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, somewhere around what a trail marker told us was mile 23 for that particular section, we found a pack. It was a serious pack, an internal frame, the kind you buy for long multi-day trips. It was leaning against a tree about 10 feet off the trail, as if someone had set it down and walked away. Not dropped, placed. We stopped and looked at it for a minute without approaching, just taking it in. There was no one nearby. No tent, no sign of a camp. The pack was sitting in the middle of nowhere, miles from any trailhead. Sarah and I debated for a minute and then approached it. The pack was loaded, full, heavy, fully loaded. The hip belt was fastened. The compression straps were done up. Everything was organized and ready to hike. Whoever had set this down had not been planning to leave it. We opened the top pocket. Inside were the usual small items you'd keep accessible. Energy bars, a lighter, a small first aid kit, a folded piece of paper. We unfolded the paper. It was a hand-drawn map, detailed, careful. It showed a section of terrain that did not correspond to the trail we were on, a different set of ridges, a creek, and a location marked with an X. Below the X, written in the same careful hand, were the words, "Don't come here." We put the paper back. We looked at each other for a moment. We stepped back onto the trail and kept moving. Neither of us suggested anything else. We just kept moving. We reported the pack to trail maintenance volunteers when we got out, and eventually it made its way to the local sheriff's department for that county. About a month later, I followed up with a call to that department. They had found the pack's owner through a tag inside. The owner had filed a missing person report, not for themselves, for a friend they'd been hiking with, who had not come back from a solo walk-off trail in that same section. As far as I know, that person was never found. I've wondered for 2 years who drew that map and who wrote those words. I've wondered if the person who was lost knew about the X on the map and walked toward it anyway, or away from it. I've wondered what is at that location. Sarah and I finished that section on a subsequent trip and didn't stop at mile 23. We didn't even slow down. Story 9. The last night on Roan Mountain, I was 26, and this was my first solo backpacking trip ever. I want to be upfront about that because it matters. I had done plenty of camping with other people and had good basic skills, but I had never been out overnight completely alone. I chose Roan Mountain in Tennessee, partly because I'd read it was stunning, and partly because the trail was clear and well-maintained, and I figured I couldn't go too wrong. I was wrong about that. I'm not going to pretend the early part of the trip was anything but great, because it was. The balds on Roan are unlike anything I'd seen before. Wide open grassy areas above the tree line with views in every direction. I felt confident and capable all the way up. Made my first camp at the edge of a forest below the bald, cooked a good meal, sat out watching the stars, felt like I had this whole solo camping thing completely figured out. Day 2, I walked the bald and explored, and it was everything I hoped it would be. By mid-afternoon, I was setting up for my second night, this time in the trees a bit further down the mountain to get out of the wind. Still within a reasonable walk of the open bald. This is when I noticed a man watching me. He was at the edge of the tree line, maybe 60 yards away, just standing. Not hiking, not looking at the view, looking at me. I noticed him while I was pitching my tent, and I stopped what I was doing and looked at him directly. He didn't move or react to being noticed. He just kept watching. After a minute, he turned and walked into the trees and was gone. I finished setting up camp and tried not to think too much about it. There were other hikers on the mountain. I'd passed several that day. The man was probably just pausing, probably just curious. I told myself this for about 4 hours while I sat at my campsite, increasingly unable to relax. I made dinner and cleaned up and got everything into my bear hang, and was in my tent by 8:30, much earlier than I'd planned. I lay there reading and listening to the wind in the trees. Around 11, I heard footsteps near my tent. Not right outside it, more like someone moving through the trees and maybe 20 or 30 feet away. The footsteps moved around the perimeter of where I'd set up, not in a straight line, in a way that suggested someone circling the campsite. They made a slow circuit and then moved off. I told myself it was an animal. I told myself this very firmly. 40 minutes later, the footsteps came back. Same pattern. A slow circuit of the campsite, staying 20 or 30 feet out in the trees, not approaching but not leaving. This time they stopped on one side of the tent and stayed there for a while. Long enough that I stopped telling myself it was an animal. I am not proud of how scared I was. I lay in that tent holding my knife with both hands and trying to remember how to breathe normally. The footsteps eventually moved off again. This time they didn't come back. I stayed awake until 4 in the morning, and then exhaustion took over and I fell asleep. I woke up with the sun and packed up in record time. I was off the mountain and back at the trailhead by 9. On the way down, I passed a man coming up, middle-aged, hiking alone, no acknowledgement as we passed. I can't say it was the same man I saw watching me from the tree line. I genuinely don't know. The clothing seems similar, but I can't be sure. What I can say is that the feeling I had in that tent, lying still in the dark while something circled me outside, is one that doesn't fully go away. I've done 6 or 7 more solo trips since then. I camp. But I am different out there than I was before that trip. I am more careful, more aware, and I have a much clearer understanding of what it means to be alone somewhere, where no one knows exactly where you are. I still love backpacking. I'm not going to stop. But I will never again be the person who sets out thinking nothing can go wrong. Story 10. The photographs. I want to preface this by saying I still don't have a complete explanation for what happened. I've gone back and forth on whether to submit this because one piece of it is so strange that I worry it's going to undermine the rest. But I've decided to just tell it as accurately as I can and let you draw your own conclusions. My name isn't important. What matters is that I'm a woman in my mid-30s, and I've been hiking solo in the Appalachians since I was in college. 12 years of solo backcountry experience, a lot of it in the mountains of Georgia and North Carolina. I know what I'm doing out there, and I take my safety seriously. I say this not to brag, but to establish that what happened to me was not a result of inexperience or carelessness. 2 summers ago, I did a 6-day solo trip in the Chattahoochee National Forest in northern Georgia, moving through a remote section of trail that sees very little traffic. Day 1 through day 3 were completely normal. Hot, beautiful, hard miles, no other hikers. I was deep enough in by the third night that I hadn't seen a road or structure since the first day. On the morning of day 4, I woke up and came out of my tent to get water from a nearby creek and found a digital camera sitting on the flat rock I'd been using as a prep surface the night before. Just sitting there. A small point-and-shoot camera, relatively new, no case, left in the center of the rock like a gift left out deliberately. I stood there for a long time looking at it. I'd heard nothing in the night. There had been no sign of anyone else in the area. And yet here was this camera that had not been there when I went to bed. Against what was probably good judgment, I picked it up. It was a standard camera, no identifying marks on the outside. I turned it on. The battery was about half charged. I went to the photo viewer. There were 43 photographs on the camera. The first 30 or so were mundane. Landscape shots, trail photos, what looked like images from several different hiking trips, over what I guessed was a period of years based on the varying foliage. A few photos of what appeared to be a campsite. Nothing alarming. The last 12 photographs were of me, all taken in the previous 3 days. I recognized the locations immediately. The creek crossing on day 1, the open ridge I'd crossed on day 2, my campsite from the night before. In several of the photos, I was close enough to the camera that whoever took them had been within 30 or 40 feet of me, without my knowing it. In one of them, I was asleep in my tent, and the image had been taken through the mesh panel on the tent door. I could see my own face in the photograph. I put the camera in my pack, broke camp in about 8 minutes, and did not stop walking for 5 hours. I covered 18 miles that day, the most miles I've ever done in a single day with a full pack. I came out at a Forest Service road, flagged down a passing truck, and got a ride to the nearest town. I reported the camera to the local sheriff's department along with the photographs. They took it seriously, took a report, kept the camera as evidence. I gave a full account of where I'd camped each night and which trails I'd been on. A deputy drove me back to retrieve my car from the trailhead where I'd parked at the start of the trip. As far as I know, no one was ever identified or charged. The deputy I dealt with was professional and took everything seriously, but he also told me that without more information, there wasn't a lot they could do. I never heard back from that department with any update. I have not done a solo trip in Georgia since. I've gone back to Virginia and North Carolina, where I have more established trail networks and more familiarity with the terrain and the people. I've told myself that what happened was an isolated incident, that there is no reason to believe I would encounter something like that again. Most days I believe that, but I still think about whoever was 30 feet away from me while I slept, close enough to photograph my face through the door of my tent, and then walked away and left the evidence sitting on a rock for me to find in the morning like they wanted me to know. That's the part that I can't make sense of. They left it there on purpose. What does that mean? I've turned it over in my mind hundreds of times and I've never come up with an answer that doesn't keep me awake. Story 11. The road that wasn't on the map. My brother and I have a tradition of doing one big camping trip together every year. We grew up in Kentucky and have spent a lot of time in the Daniel Boone National Forest and the Red River Gorge area. But a few years back, we started pushing further into the Appalachians, trying sections of trail we'd never been on. We're both in our 40s now, experienced enough to handle most of what the backcountry throws at you, and we've had our share of hard trips, weather, injuries, wrong turns. We've managed. What happened on this trip was different because it didn't feel like something nature did to us. It felt like something a person did. This was a 5-day trip in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, moving through a section of trail that cuts through some genuinely remote terrain. The kind of country where old family land and national forest overlap in complicated ways, where you cross from public land to private land and back again, and the boundaries aren't always obvious. We've hiked in areas like that before, and we know to be respectful, stay on the trail, don't camp near posted land. The first 2 days went without incident. On the morning of the third day, we came to a section of trail that should, according to our map, have crossed a Forest Service road, passed through a small clearing, and continued up a hollow toward a ridgeline. That's what the map showed. What we actually found was a gate, a heavy steel gate across the trail, padlocked with a hand-painted sign on it that said, "Private. Do not enter." The gate ran into a fence on either side, maybe 100 yards of chain link in both directions, cutting directly across the trail corridor. We stood there looking at it for a while. The trail was supposed to continue through here. It was on the map, it was a maintained trail. We'd confirmed it with the ranger station before we left. And here was this gate. My brother walked the fence line looking for a way around. The fence was solid and well maintained, and the terrain on either side was dense enough that getting around it would have meant serious bushwhacking on a hillside. I tried my phone. No signal. We had a satellite communicator, but using it to call for a ranger response over a locked gate felt like an overreaction. We were standing there debating our options when I noticed the truck. It was parked in the trees on the other side of the gate, maybe 50 yards back. An old pickup, dark green, partially obscured by the undergrowth. It had been there for a while, judging by the leaves on the hood. And there was someone in it. I could see the silhouette of a person in the driver's seat, sitting perfectly still, watching us. I pointed it out to my brother quietly. He saw it. Neither of us said anything for a moment. I raised a hand in a wave. The silhouette didn't move. We discussed, quietly, with our backs to the truck, what to do. The presence of a person sitting in a parked vehicle, watching us through a locked gate in the middle of the woods, not responding to acknowledgement, not getting out, not saying anything, was enough to make both of us agree that we didn't want to stay where we were. We backtracked about 2 miles to a junction we'd passed that morning and took a different route, adding several miles to our day. It was late afternoon before we found a reasonable campsite, and by then, we'd both been quiet for a long time, just processing. Around 9 that night, and after dinner and fire and some time to decompress, my brother said he'd noticed something at the gate that he hadn't mentioned at the time, because he wasn't sure what to make of it. Hanging from the padlock on the gate, he'd seen a length of cord, and at the end of the cord, tied carefully, was a small bundle of what looked like dried plant material, and what might have been small bones. He'd thought it was odd, but hadn't wanted to say it out loud at the time, standing 50 yards from someone in a truck who wasn't moving. I don't know what to make of any of it. The gate blocking a legitimate trail, the truck, the figure that wouldn't acknowledge us, the thing hanging from the lock. Individually, each of those things might have an explanation. Together, they made us both feel like we had stumbled into something we were not supposed to see, and that whoever owned that gate was making it very clear that we should go a different way. We finished the trip. We went home. I filed a report with the Forest Service about the trail obstruction, which was a legitimate issue regardless of everything else. They told me they'd look into it. I've checked back twice since then. The trail is still closed at that point. I don't know if it ever got resolved, and I've never gone back to that area to find out. If these stories have you second-guessing your next camping trip, drop a comment below telling us where you camp and what trail you've had your most uncomfortable experience on. We read every single comment, and some of the best ones find their way into future videos. Before you go, if any of these stories sound familiar because something similar happened to you, or if you have your own experience from the Appalachian region that you've been wanting to get off your chest, send it to us. The link is in the description. Every submission is read. We don't share names or identifying information without permission, and we keep everything confidential. The stories on this channel exist because people trusted us with them, and we take that seriously. Send us yours.